All
Okay.
right. Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking an extra hour this week to join our special session. And so this week, we really want to start thinking about a few different ways for considering how climate change is going to impact different tree species. So this presentation is really something that complements all of the work that we do in step 2 of the adaptation workbook for really thinking about ecosystem vulnerability. And it's also helpful for starting to think about some of those different components of tree species adaptation, which we'll get to in step 4, and can provide some helpful information for you to come back to once we get to that step to really start thinking about some of those different climate adaptation strategies for different tree species. So we used to cram all of this into a lecture for step 2 and instead decided that's too much. So this special session is really a great opportunity to talk specifically about the climate change tree atlas and habitat suitability tools that are available. All right, so today, what we're going to cover are, again, that climate change tree atlas, which presents modeled changes in suitable habitat for 125 different tree species in the eastern United States, which is based on forest inventory data and downscaled climate models. And it's been developed by a team of researchers from the Northern Research Station of the Forest Service and the Landscape Change Research Group. And I'll give Steve a minute to introduce himself here in a second. But basically, we'll be talking about this tool as a way to really think about some of those climate habitat suitability projections. And then we'll run through a demo of what the tree atlas looks like, how you can utilize it, provide an example of how it's been applied on the ground, and then also start to think about some of those different other tools for if your project for the adaptation planning and practices course is located outside of the Eastern region, including heat and hardiness zones and growing degree days, as well as a tool called the Seedlot selection tool. And so we are interested if you're focusing more on a natural or rural forest ecosystem for your project, or if you're really focusing in an urban area for your project, please chat that in. We'll try to keep track of that throughout this presentation and really tailor some of the demonstrations we're providing for the tree atlas to your different projects, depending on what you're focusing on. So with that, I also should mention, I'm Courtney Peterson. I'm a climate adaptation specialist with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS, and one of the instructors for our adaptation planning and practices course. And Steve Matthews is co-presenting with me today, and I'm going to hand it off to Steve so that he can introduce himself and his team that he works with.
Great, it's great. It's awesome to be here. It's always really fun to have these discussions and to be able to share a little bit about the atlas. So yeah, so I'm Steve Matthews. I'm an associate professor in School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State, and I have a joint appointment with the Northern Research Station Region 6. So we've been working on this atlas for quite a while. So in the picture there is Natha Prasad, Matt Peters, Lewis Iverson, and myself, and really started working on this. I got involved around 2000, and Lewis and Prasad worked a couple years ahead of that, got it all started, and we are on the Atlas version 4. So it's really fun to go through with the example here, and throughout time, and as we've improved with the models and those aspects, it's a lot of the improvements have really come through the collaboration with NIACS and other folks who are using these data. And so what the product that we'll look at is really a result of user input. So please give us input to keep making it better. So that's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. We're really lucky to have Steve with us today to really share his knowledge and expertise about the tree atlas and how awesome that tool is. So thanks, Steve, for taking the time to be here with us today. So again, the Climate Change Tree Atlas, as Steve just said, is a tool that lets you explore current tree species traits and suitable habitats in the eastern United States and how they're likely to be affected by a changing climate. And again, we're on version 4 of the Tree Atlas. There's also a Bird Atlas, which is built on the same framework and similar principles apply. And so if you're interested in bird species, you should definitely also check out the Bird Atlas, which covers 147 different bird species. And so the information we're going to cover today is really to help us think about how do we want to assess whether current tree species are at risk from climate change, and how are we supposed to start to think about identifying future adapted species for projects. So this is a great prompt for us to start thinking about how do we want to facilitate, promote, or create those conditions through our climate adaptive management that are favorable for future tree species through your projects that are a part of this adaptation planning and practices course. So the Climate Change Tree Atlas is, again, this web-based tool, which includes 3 main components. And so the Tree Atlas really brings together information about habitat suitability, which is powered by a distribution model, migration potential, which is estimating the potential colonization likelihood of these suitable habitats for these different tree species, and finally, tree species traits, which are used to help evaluate the potential adaptability of those individual tree species based on different biological and disturbance factors. So altogether, these 3 components can ultimately help us understand what are the current and potential future distributions for those different 125 tree species that are included in the Climate Change Tree Atlas. And so when we're talking about the Tree Atlas, we're really talking about these 3 different components. And depending on which questions you want to ask and what you're trying to address with your management, you might want to look at a particular component. So you can really use the Atlas to start to answer questions such as where are tree species currently located, what predictor variables such as soil type or elevation contribute to them being at that current location, what might happen to suitable habitat and migration potential under different climate scenarios. And so all of this information can really help us make those decisions about how we want to manage our forests, or simply get to an idea about how the environment might be different in the future under a changing climate and different climate scenarios. So it's really important, again, as we're going through this tool, to remember that these models only predict where a species suitable habitat will be in the future and how likely they are to potentially colonize new habitats through the end of the century. So the Atlas can't predict whether the trees will actually be there in the future, since that depends on actual changes in tree distribution will depend on other factors, including competition with other species, forest pests, land use change, and ultimately the decisions that we decide to implement as managers and the tools we use on the ground. So I'm going to go into each of these components briefly in a very simple terms overview, and then Steve will provide a demonstration of how these different components work. So the first component is habitat suitability. So if you've been on the Tree Atlas, this is probably what you've seen, because people really like to look at what is that current habitat versus projected habitat suitability. And so the way this works is we use forest inventory and analysis data that's been collected by the Forest Service and states to really understand where tree species are currently located. And so that's the figure on the left showing that current habitat. The darker the color, the more abundant that species is in a particular place. And I think this example is for slash pine. And so what the modelers from the Landscape Change Research Group and Steve and his team do, in very, very simple terms, is look at the relationships between where a tree species is found and the temperature, precipitation, soil conditions, and other site conditions associated with that tree species. So they're really looking at the relationship of a particular species associated with a certain climate, soil conditions, elevation, latitude, slope, or aspects, and putting together those ideas around the type of sites where you might find slash pine or other species. Then what they do is they put in the future climate projections and really look at where those relationships will continue to hold in the future. So it's not saying where a species will move to, but instead, here's where those habitat conditions are likely to continue to exist in the future, given these different climate scenarios. And that's the information they use to create those maps. And the example is on the right for future habitat suitability. So by modeling a species habitat, we can really figure out where that current and future habitats might occur. When you visit the Tree Atlas, you're also going to see that there are data and maps from 3 different global climate models. And we're looking under both a low emissions and a high emissions scenario to get a range of possible future conditions. So you can really start to compare and contrast how sensitive a particular species is based on these different scenarios. So for many of the species in the atlas, future habitats can be different depending on whether you're looking at that low or high emission scenario. And it's uncertain which emission scenario will most closely match with those future conditions, since it really depends on human actions and policies. So even a low emission scenario can cause some notable changes for many species, and following a path of high emissions will likely create a much more disturbance to the condition for those living organisms. So again, it's really important as we're using this tool to think about what are those low versus high emission scenarios and compare and contrast what that will be for that potential future habitat suitability. The second component of the tree atlas is the colonization potential. And so in addition to current and future habitat suitability, the tree atlas provides information about potential species migration. So once new suitable habitats are identified, we use a migration model which simulates natural seed dispersal at historical migration rates and estimates the potential colonization likelihood of these habitats. So together, these two approaches really help us evaluate which newly suitable habitats are likely to become colonized with those natural dispersal rates under future climates. And so again, you can look at these different colonization potentials under both low and high emission scenarios. And then finally, the third component of the tree atlas is called adaptability. And so two types of species traits are really used to evaluate the potential adaptability of the 125 species in the tree atlas. And so those are biological factors and disturbance factors. So we include 9 biological factors such as shade tolerance or seedling establishment to really think about adaptability, as well as 12 different disturbance factors, which can include things like drought, pests and pathogens, or potentially fire top kill. So the uncertainty within the literature is also included in the ratings for these different individual factors and a part of the consideration for the adaptability score. And so these scores basically capture the overall influence of all of these variables for each factor on an individual species. And when merged together, create an overall adaptability score that indicates a species' potential adaptability relative to all of the species evaluated under climate change. And so we've got an example of red maple on here as a highly positive, having a high score for both those biological and disturbance factors. So it's going to have a higher adaptability rating relative to other tree species in the tree atlas. On the other end of the spectrum is balsam fir, which has low negative scores for both biological and disturbance factors. And so therefore it's less adaptable relative to those other species, again, in the tree atlas. So that's a really quick, simplistic overview of these 3 components of the tree atlas. And what I'm going to do now is pause and hand it off to Steve to really demonstrate what this looks like in the tree atlas itself. And while Steve's pulling up his screen, if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw those in the chat or unmute and ask them.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a great summary. If folks have questions, please.
And I saw Alan raise his hand.
Yeah, go for it.
Is there any way to zoom in on the map if you want to look at your state or your region more closely?
Yeah, that's a great one. So, I mean, so the way in which we'll talk a little bit about, some of the regional summaries where you can get information specific to it. Zooming in on the map is not quite as easy as we would like it, and that's something we're working on. I will say that all of the data are available. So if you really want to get into it, you can, but we'll go through a couple ways in which you can at least get a better picture of it, and you can zoom in a little bit. So we can't zoom fully into each species, but there's ways that we can get that information, and especially more importantly, maybe the summaries of how much change in a particular region is what we'll talk about too, of how we can use it. Yeah, but we're working on it on that. Yep. Great. Let's see. Why don't we start with this? So there's a couple of different ways I guess we can go. There's it's a small enough group, there's questions as we're going, just please let me know. So basically what I'm going to do is just kind of walk through kind of how I would use the atlas and point out a couple of aspects. So right now on the screen, we're kind of looking at the landing page for the atlas. But I guess I'm not going to talk about the bird atlas today, in part because we don't necessarily have time, but we're on the second version of the bird atlas, the fourth version of the tree atlas. And we're going to really dive into those components. So individual species pages at the top. And at the bottom, once we kind of go through individual species pages, we're going to talk some more about the regional summaries, just to give you a sense for what kind of data are there. I will just, before I begin, just point out that over on the tutorial side is a really kind of great kind of set of tools and videos that kind of help folks get through the different components of the atlas, where it's just what the atlas is, or using the different biological and disturbance factors, thinking about the outputs, and so on and so forth. And then at the end, we'll probably come back to talk a little bit about the hardiness zones and growing degree day information for areas outside the atlas footprint, and that also can be accessed from the atlas. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and kind of jump into it. So what I'm going to do is just click on the tree atlas list of the latest tree atlas page, and it's going to come to the tree kind of landing page, and still all of this information is present on the right hand side. And so to do this, right, we can pick any number of species. Does anyone have a favorite species that they want to look at? Anyone feel like they really want to dive into something? No, if not, I'll pick one. All right, I guess I'll pick one. We can look at a couple. And if things come up in the chat, maybe Courtney can let me know too, just so I can go for it. Well, let's just start off, so it's basically just text. I mean, if you just wanted to oak, all I typed in was oak here, and let's just, for the fun of it, we'll look at southern red oak, just to kind of mirror kind of some of the components. All right, and so then that comes up, and we can kind of click to enter into the individual species page. So this looks similar to what Courtney had in some of the outputs of the species. The thing I'm going to note just before I begin is this important aspects of model reliability. This is really kind of capturing 5 different measures of the performance of how well that model did at capturing its current distribution. So what I mean by that, if we look at this current figure that comes up, this is showing the actual importance value. So this measure of a relative abundance, number of stem, basal area of southern red oak from forest inventory analysis data, right? And so those are the inputs. And as Courtney was saying, we then try to model what those habitats current abundance looks like across the distribution, right? And if we do that, right, you notice there's some change, right? There's a little bit of spreading out, there's filling in, right? Because FIA plots aren't everywhere. But this is pretty much capturing a very similar kind of pattern that we have within the actual FI data, right? And so that is the current modeled output that we use to inform us, right? And so this is really important just from basic understanding of what are the components for such as tree species, right? So we can go down here and actually look at the individual predictors, and you'll note that there's these numbers in brackets, and these are actually getting at the variables importance in generating that model. So something like growing season precipitation was a pretty important predictor in describing the abundance patterns of southern red oak, right? So that's a climate variable up there. I'm just scrolling down just to get at some other ones, and we can talk about them. Amount of clay kind of within the forest was another one. And I'll just pick another one, maybe just a very general kind of a variable, right? We have clay, and maybe I'll do elevation, even though so it's this idea of coefficient of variation elevation, right? So that kind of gets at, where is there a lot of change or not, right? Within elevation, right? So those are the predictors that go into going from the forest inventory analysis data, right, to the current modeled habitat, right? So that's where we are now, as Courtney was describing. And then we may be interested, right, in thinking about, right, how much we want to think about what is the future habitat for those. For now, you can see these are the 3 different climate models that we have, and for those we have 2 different pathways. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm just going to click on the average of these 3 GCMs, right? And then look at that habitat change for the end of the century. And you'll notice that this is under the RCP 8.5. So the higher emissions component. We can also look at RCP 4.5 and middle emissions. So just as Courtney kind of had pulled together. A couple things to note. At the bottom here, you'll note we have this component of this ratio of the current to future importance value, right? This is getting that amount of change, right? Overall. So this case, a species like southern red oak is projected to increase quite a bit in terms of suitable habitat. Not necessarily that it will be there or not under 8.5. So this gives us a sense of that habitat component, that first kind of key component. What's describing the species distribution, what variables, and how those habitats might change as climate continues to change through the end of the century. Of course, we know southern red oak is not going to make it on its own to Maine by the end of the century, right? And so this is really where the shift model comes into play. So if we click on this, right, we immediately see a kind of a little bit of a different story. I'm noticing the legend here is very complicated, right? It's as simple as we could get. But the easiest way to describe it is combining 2 components. The HQ is combining that habitat suitability aspect. So habitat suitability might be low, right, medium, or high. And the next component of that is, what is that colonization likelihood? Right? Over the course of this century, how many generations might that species have? So that's going to depend on each species. That term varies. But then what is the chance for it to potentially migrate or move in that time period? And so, these are all grayed out here because there's really very little chance, or there's no chance essentially on its own for those species making it that far. As we get into the lighter blues, right, we kind of get into this kind of middle habitat quality to somewhat suitable habitat. Right, as we get into the darker blues, these are really within that range of a couple 100 kilometers of where that species currently occurs. Right, so it gives us this view of thinking about what is the potential for those species to move. So it kind of it allows us to think about a different process, right, which is dispersal for trees and those components. And I'll point out at this point, right over here, this interpretation kind of phase is kind of our quick summary of how we interpret what's going on with each model. And this was Louis Iverson, who retired a couple of years ago, who is really the founder of and Prasad of the atlases, right? He went through each species and kind of wrote his summary. So I think that's a great resource because it gives you a sense for the process by how we think about it. Like, where is a species abundant? Where does shift come in into that aspect? And then what I'll point out next is, right, this idea of the adaptability components, right? So in this case, right, we're thinking about what are the characteristics of that species that may make it more or less adaptable to the climate change, life history characteristics. So if you click on adaptability, right, you can click on that button again, and it essentially comes up with each of the traits that we rated from -3 to +3, right? And these are relative scores to each other. Right, and we want to think about what is the literature saying, Silvics in North America, other resources, how kind of consistent is that information, and then thinking about how important will that be going into the future. So really, southern red oak is kind of in the middle. It's not like red maple, it's not like balsam fir, but so maybe I'll go back to one of those other ones in a second. But it gives us that aspects of things we can't necessarily model. Right. If I were to switch it up, it's pretty easy to switch it up. If I were to do red maple, let's just switch that over so you can get a sense for what that looks like. So now we have red maple, right? We could do all the same stuff if we want to in terms of habitat and shift. But if we went down to adaptability, we see all these positive traits, right? Shade tolerance, seedling establishment, all those things that set it up well. So that is one component, right? Those are the 3 components: habitat model, the shift, colonization likelihood, and adaptability. Yeah, I'm not going to go through all of these other pieces because there's a lot more here. You could, if you're really interested in and learning more about the predictors and what variables are important you can. It's probably suffice to say that this ranks the ones that are most important in terms of our modeling. I will just quickly show a summary of predictors because sometimes that's helpful to see visually. And you can look at the individual things, maps, if you want to download them. And this is where you can download them in a little bit higher resolution. But you can also, maybe you're interested in the difference, right? What cells are those cells that are exhibiting changes, increases or decreases in habitat? And that can also be informative as you're kind of thinking about where within a species range are habitats likely to increase in the blues or decline in the more enclosed areas there. So again, noting for red maple, right, this is one that has a higher model reliability. And so let's see. Those are the kind of key kind of aspects to it without kind of going into some of these other boxes, but there's lots of other information about the species themselves to go from. Courtney, do you want me to just continue on and talk about the regional summaries at this point? Or maybe I'll pause and see if there's any initial questions on this or other species folks want me to give.
Yeah, we can take some quick questions. And then I think looking at the regional and forest summaries would be really helpful.
Okay.
So you've got a question, why might an end user choose one or another of the GCMs? Is it best to use the average of 3 if you have no specific reason to use one?
Great. I love that question. So there's lots of different components to that, right? And so the individual GCMs can be really helpful on their own, right? So Hadley is typically more of a hotter, drier scenario, right? Where CCM, is, or GFDL or CCM, right? Maybe warmer and wetter, right? So you have these different components in terms of how that future climate is projected to change, because they kind of are all, obviously based on physics of climate, right? They take into those aspects. Some are more or less sensitive to CO2, right? So that's why we provide each of them, because it can be informative to get a sense for how different they are. So you don't see too much of a difference for red maple in this case, but you do see some shrinking and contraction of these really high habitat kind of values for the future, right? So that just showing the difference between those three here. I think you can see the best example between the Hadley and the CCM, right? This is a bit wetter, right? Whereas Hadley's a bit drier, so we see a decline in habitat. So it's important to look at the range. The average of the three does provide one place to start, right? And where there's consensus is across those three. And especially when using the average, contrasting the difference between, RCP 4.5 and 8.5 can be really important. While for red maple, it's maybe not as big of a change, right? If you went to maybe, American beech, just to have a species that has a kind of a little bit of different trajectory, right? It's current modeled habitat. If you went to the Hadley, we have the spreading out under one, right? And so this is where it's important to think about what is driving this kind of low potential habitat down here. And it's just very low background stuff. And that's why it's important to look at multiple models to try to get a consensus of where they are. And for these species, like thinking about where those higher important habitat variables are coming into play. So it's all there. They're all important to use. But a lot of times we look at, depending on our question, what we're interested in. But you looking at a range can be important. Are there any other places folks wanted me to go? Or should I move on over? All right, well, we can come back to this because that's the important part, but we'll want to come back to it. The next aspect of it is, this is great. You can look at it for one individual species at a time. But if you're interested in managing a region, right, that doesn't really help you too much in some ways. So if we then provide these summaries that we call regional summary tables. And so we can look at any number of ways in which these data are kind of grouped by a region. So if you're in a national forest, we can kind of get to a list of all the national forests. and we can begin to look at those summaries. Does anyone have a particular geography that we'd be interested in? So we have national forests, parks, watersheds, ecoregions. I'll show one by one, just because this is essentially a grid of 1 degree by 1 degree blocks that you can look at. That's probably not too exciting to look at right now, but it gives you a little more local kind of view this way. Does anyone, or urban areas are a little different, right? In that we kind of have mapped and looked at the individual urban areas. I know folks were interested in natural systems, so maybe we'll stick with one of those for the moment. And we'll just pick a national forest. I'm just going with the top. I'm just going with Allegheny National Forest, just because it's first. But if someone wants me to look at another one, we can. So basically, the first thing I want to point out is, for each of these regional summaries, oftentimes there's the boundary, right, for Allegheny National Forest. The dots represent forest inventory analysis plots within this region. And then there's often a buffer, because we want to make sure there's enough area to draw meaningful statistical comparisons within there, right? We're talking about 10 by 10 kilometer cells, right? They're pretty big, and we want to have enough cells that we can draw reasonable summaries of the information from the atlas. So that's the kind of a map of those locations. And then you can look at it either via a PDF or via Excel to download and really kind of dive into the individual species pages, right? So in this case, the first page of the summary, right, really provides kind of the context for the region. So again, Allegheny National Forest, the area, the kind of general information about the species composition, species model reliability, as we say, that's important. Potential changes, species potential to increase or decrease by about 20% of their current habitat, and some of those other summaries. Another thing that we recently added was this summary of the climate information in 30-year time steps, right, from 2000 essentially to the end of the century. And these are all the variables that are kind of within our individual species distribution models, right? So we can get a sense for how does growing degree days change in the Allegheny National Forest under these different models and scenarios. Here again, we're showing the individual DCMs at those different RCPs. Temperatures generally increasing, right? Whether it's a couple degrees in this location or more in others. Precipitation kind of really all over the board depending on the models, and that's why it's important to look at multiple models. The next aspect within the PDF version, right, is this big table, which can be intimidating, but it's not meant to be intimidating, right? It's meant to kind of give a summary for each species and what its current range is, right? We have the species, we have model reliability, forest FIA sum, what's the summed importance value within that region for red maple and black cherry, obviously the two top ones if we're talking Allegheny National Forest. Projected changes under 4.5 and 8.5. So declines for both of those, top couple of species, but some of them are relatively small declines, except for red maple in terms of a large decrease in habitat. And then we have this adaptability, which is that life history traits that Courtney was talking about, right? Thinking about disturbance and biological characteristics. And then this aspect of capability really combines how abundant is the species currently, what's the potential change in habitat, and how adaptable are its life history characteristics, right? So even though something like red maple is projected to decline, right, it's probably still in decent shape in terms of capability over the next century as it relates to climate change. Whereas black cherry, right, it has smaller declines, it's fairly abundant, right, but it has some lower adaptability, so it's really only in this fair kind of rating. And so we kind of do this for all of these different summaries. And that's why it's important to go back and forth between the maps and the other components, because if we wanted to look back at black cherry, right, we might want to understand a little bit more within that region of Allegheny, kind of the hot spot for black cherry. Why is that projected to decline? within those areas. Hadley, it's still there, right? We still have aspects of it, but it's not nearly, right, as high importance value. So that's that kind of decline in habitat, right? And then we think about the life history traits. Well, we know it has, fire top kill aspect, we know pests, and those other components kind of contribute to that lower adaptability score. So it's really kind of going back and forth between the regional summaries, right, that really provide all of the information about the individual species to start putting it together. And at the end of the day, it's really using the local knowledge that we have, that you have, not to think about these results in the context of your current management goals, as well as the current forest management settings. And I will add on the Excel files, right, there's definitions for all of these kind of tables. So it really makes sense to look at them and go back and forth with the maps. What else I think that basically covers the tree atlas, individual species pages, and the regional summaries. Are there any questions or other things that we want to make sure we cover here with this at this time? All right, I'm gonna stop sharing then for the moment.
Thanks, Steve. That was perfect. That was a great summary and tour of the tree atlas. Does anyone else have any questions? Awesome. I'll also point out that, again, those tutorials are really helpful and they do dive into these different components. So if you need a quick refresh on any of these things Steve gave us a tour on, definitely check out those tutorials because they're a great summary of where to find that information and how to interpret the results. Has anyone, Daniel asked, used the tree atlas results in your work? Anybody want to share if you've used the tree atlas before? Not yet. Hopefully this will encourage you to use it. All right, awesome. What we want to do now is really think about an example of how this has been applied for how we've used the results from the tree atlas and management on the ground. So I'm just going to quickly walk through an example from the Chippewa National Forest, which is a part of our Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network, or ASK. And so this is a experimental trial where we have 14 sites across the US and Canada that are really testing different adaptation options and responses to climate change. This was our first site that was developed as a part of this network. Again, it's located on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest of the Chippewa National Forest. And it is, we did a workshop to come together, to bring together the managers and the scientists to really think about how do we achieve goals and objectives under climate change based on these impacts and really incorporate it into a silvicultural prescription for the Chippewa National Forest as a part of this experiment. And so we did the workshop in 2013 and implemented this site in 2014. And the site is led again by Brian Palick with the Northern Research Station of the Forest Service. So the site is located in a Laurentian Acadian Northern Pine Oak woodland. So basically it's a mixed species forest ecosystem that's dominated primarily by red pine, but also has components of eastern white pine, balsam fir, white spruce, jack pine, trembling and big-tooth aspen, red maple, northern red oak, bur oak, and paper birch. So each of those species make up a smaller component of that mixed species woodland. And it's also been classified as a northern dried mesic mixed woodland type. So this is a fire-dependent ecosystem. It's really used to having these mixed severity fire regimes. The area we were looking at had a fire in the early 1900s and had had fire suppression in the area since. The mixed pines or the mixed species forest is also used to having those variably open tree canopies and occupy sandy, droughty prone soils. And so we were really thinking about what are some of these climate change impacts for this area. And some of the overarching ones, like you are figuring out for your step 2, were increased growing season drought, warmer, wetter winter conditions, and increased threats from potential new pests, such as the potential for mountain pine beetle to make it to this area when it hasn't been there in the past. And so you can see, especially for that Laurentian Acadian forest type in northern Minnesota, those temperatures are significantly increasing, particularly in the winter. And then we also ran some quick climate analogs just to help us really tell the story of the climate impacts at this site. And so you can see that by the end of the century, winters are going to be similar to those of Wisconsin and Illinois, which is showing that blue Minnesota covering Wisconsin and Illinois. So those are those winter projections. And summers are going to be similar to those of Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. So we're really starting to see, again, those increases and warmer, wetter winter conditions for this northern Minnesota forest. So based on that information, we also wanted to use the tree atlas to really help us figure out what do we want to plant, how are our local species that are a part of this forest going to change? And so we really started to think about those habitat suitability for those northern tree species. So we found that, especially for a lot of those dominant species in this forest type, including red pine, there's projected to be some small decreases under both those low and high emission scenarios. And red pine is also very sensitive to drought conditions, and there's those challenges from insects and diseases, including the potential for mountain pine beetle in the area. So that gave us a snapshot of what's going to happen with some of these dominant species within this forest. We also looked at there's the potential for increases in habitat suitability for a couple of these native species, including bur oak and eastern white pine, which are going to have those large increases under both low and high emission scenarios, as well as some southern species that are just south of the Cutfoot experimental forest and still in Minnesota. So things like white oak and black cherry having those large increases, and then new potential habitat for bitternut hickory. So again, looking at that colonization potential of that species as well. So what we ultimately ended up doing, we had 3 distinct treatments. The first one is resistance. So we really wanted to maintain those relatively unchanged conditions over time. So we wanted to continue to maintain that red pine dominance of the stand and really reduce stocking to something that's closer to some of those historical conditions and will be more adapted to those drought and fire conditions. So what we did was a free thin, try to reduce it closer to that B line for stocking levels, and really just focus on changing that structure. So we didn't do any planting in the resistance treatment. We really wanted to maintain that red pine dominance and just reduce the stocking. The second adaptation option we used was resilience. So this is where we're allowing some change in current conditions, but encouraging an eventual return to a reference condition. And so that reference condition definition of this was really important for us in how we were framing what we wanted to plant in this treatment. And so we really wanted to still think about how do we have red pine dominance, but we want to increase that heterogeneity and complexity and structure, as well as the diversity of species within this stand. So we wanted to really think about what are some of those future adapted native species that, based on those tree atlas results, are going to have that potential increase in habitat suitability under that low and high emission scenario. So we did a variable density thinning where we created skips and gaps in a matrix. So we opened up more light conditions and then planted some of these native future adapted species in the gaps. So we brought in native species, including eastern white pine, northern red oak, bur oak, and red maple. So really planted those in those gaps, trying to increase the presence of those native species. And we also got seed sources for eastern white pine from northeastern Wisconsin, which is blister rust resistant as well. So starting to think about, it's a native species, but we want the seed source to come from a little bit further south because we're thinking about how is it going to be more adapted to these warmer, droughtier conditions. We also got our hardwood species from about 100 to 200 kilometers south of the Chippewa National Forest, still from east central Minnesota. So these, again, are all native species. They're projected to have that increase in habitat suitability, but we also wanted that southern seed source of these native species. The one that has a small decrease is jack pine, but we still, in hindsight, we might not have chosen the species, but we wanted to maintain that pine component. And so we also decided to continue to plant jack pine and see how that species does in the future in our resilience treatment as well. And then the final adaptation option we used was transition. So this is where we're actively and intentionally facilitating change and encouraging those adaptive responses. And so we really wanted something that's going to match those end of the century climate projections. So this is where we got to use the tree atlas to really think about, well, where is that colonization potential? Where is there going to be those really large increases in habitat suitability under those higher emission scenarios? And so we decided we wanted to plant both native and some novel future adapted species that are going to do well under those fire and drought and warmer temperature conditions. So we ended up planting 8 future adapted, climate adapted species, including eastern white pine, northern red oak, bur oak, and red maple, which are all native. And then we also brought in 4 novel species. So we decided to plant white oak, which was going to have that large increase, bitternut hickory, black cherry, and then also ponderosa pine, because we wanted a species that was sylvically similar to red pine, but something that was really starting to push the boundaries of what we're thinking. So ponderosa pine serves that ecological niche that red pine provides, and it was something that's also fire and drought adapted and projected to do better under some of these conditions. So we decided to get sources from South Dakota, Nebraska, and Montana and plant some ponderosa pine in the stand as well. So really thinking about how are we transitioning to this new future condition that's still going to provide the values we want to get out of this forest, have that timber product, but also increases the diversity and has those native and novel species. So that's just one example of how we utilize the tree atlas for this project. There's a lot of other examples as well. And so if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me, but this is hopefully a quick snapshot of how we've used the tree atlas and really thinking about our implementation on the Ask project at the Chippewa National Forest. So with that, I know we're getting close to time, so I want to hand it over to Steve so that he can really talk about peat hardiness and growing degree days as additional tools to use.
Sure. Yeah, I'll keep it quick because the hour went away so quickly. But yeah, this is just a component like, at the moment, the climate change atlas really is just east of the 100th meridian. We currently are really excited and have models for Western species, about 200 or so species, but that's not out there yet. And so in the meantime, how can we continue to ask these questions where we don't have tree atlas data? So Courtney, yeah, next. So one component for this, and this is similar to how other folks have kind of approached this question, is to think about some of those particular stressors that plants face, right? And so here what we have done is looked at heat zones, hardiness zones, growing degree days as 3 metrics that kind of capture 3 different dimensions of potential stress for plants and try to map how those play out historically, right, as well as projecting those into the future and into the century. So we're looking at using the RCPI emissions, growing degree days, plant hardiness zones, and heat zones. And so we have developed, there is a nice story map that was just recently updated at the link here. You can also get to it from the climate change tree atlas as well, to the story map of really this kind of interactive slider to get a sense for those components of change. So I think next slide is good. And you can also access these data if you want to download them, ArcGIS online. if you really want to have these rasters for basically these different kind of metrics of climate pressure, as well as the different emissions scenarios. So those are all available, and you can grab them if you want to look at a particular region. I think that's good for that slide. And so this is just a quick example that others have put together, and I think it's a nice kind of way of considering it. So in this case, dealing with Black Hills spruce. So we can think about this sub aspect of white spruce, right? Doesn't occur in the eastern US, and we still would want to apply some of this concepts of how climate change might influence the range itself of Black Hills spruce. And so one way of doing that is using that information regarding limits for plants, right? Heat zone, plant hardiness zones, right? We think about the minimum temperature value, and we can think about those used in plantings, right? We're all familiar with hardiness zones. And that's essentially we're capturing that minimum temperature that we would receive in winter. And on the other end of that is stress in terms of the heat zone aspect. In this case, we picked a value of basically 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So how many days are above that 86 degree aspect? So I'm just trying to pin it to just general plant values. And so if we look at Black Hills spruce and kind of from the literature, we can identify the hardiness zones 2 to 8, heat zones 1 to 7 across its range. We can then use the tool to then compare what does it look, what does that location kind of look like across its range into the future projections. So under 8.5 emission scenario, hardiness zone certainly contracts from 6 to 8, right, within that region. But then we see heat zones really contracting just in a very narrow band of 7 to 8. So number of days, over 85 degrees, it basically is kind of pushing it up to at the very upper end of 120 days over 86 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the kind of heat zone of 8. So kind of this allows you to then begin to think about the tolerances for the species under these projections. Hardiness zone, there's not as much of an impact, but there certainly is a contraction to that space over those types of temperatures, but it's kind of in some sense a release from those real minimum temperatures. But future heat zones certainly show this real kind of restriction species range over what it currently occurs. So that would lend itself to beginning to apply some of the same concepts we have in the East. When we have much more data in the East, we can kind of get into the nuances of change. But this does give us a good umbrella view of other places, other species, and how they may be pressured by climate change by the end of the century. So that's the quick summary of how to use that, use those data. So, yeah. Oh yeah, I forgot.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. And then the one other tool we just briefly wanted to mention was if you are in the Western US, the Seedlot selection tool is another web-based mapping application that can help us think about how do we match our seedlots with planting sites based on climate information. And so you can use this tool 2 ways. You can either find seedlots for where you want to plant, or you can find planting sites for your seedlot. And so based on which tool which process you want to use, you can work your way through the Seedlot selection tool. So you basically select your location, click on the map, or if you have your coordinates, you can enter those. You then select the different climate scenarios that you'd like to use. So you can pick what your seedlot is most adapted to, whether it's the recent past or current scenario, and then you can compare it to when you want your seedlot or your planting site to be adapted to. So in the next 30 years, at the end of the century. Then you can select your transfer limit. So you might have an existing zone or a seed transfer guide for your national forest from your regional geneticist. So you can pick those transfer limits that you want to bound where you're selecting from. And then ultimately select your climate variables that you want to look at. And so you can choose from 16 different temperature and precipitation related climate variables that are important for the adaptation of your species of interest or for your location. And if you don't know what to pick, there is one that's automatically generated through the Seedlot selection tool. So you can just use the customized climate variables if you'd like to for a first run as you're getting used to this tool. And then ultimately, when you hit run tool, it'll create a map and it'll show you where are those appropriate seed lots or our planting sites. And the darker the orange, the closer the match is. And so I also just wanted to quickly mention there are some guidebooks and video tutorials put together by the Pacific Northwest region of the Forest Service. And these are really helpful and a great summary of this tool and goes into a lot more detail about how to use this as well. So I'd encourage you to check out the Northwest Climate Hub's guidebook and videos on the seed lot selection tool. So with that, I think we still have 3 minutes if anyone has questions or anything else you want us to dive into before the end of our session. But thank you all so much for your time today and for joining. And thanks to Steve for that great information. Awesome. Any questions or species you'd like to quickly see?
Well, let's stop the recording just in case there aren't any. Just a huge round of applause for Steve and Courtney. Thank you so much.